So moving on to the results. There's only 6 graphs. I promise they won't be too painful. They get more exciting as we go along. The first one shows a nice, fairly steady results in the cortisol of the at-home group. So these dogs have stayed at home throughout that 30-day period. They've done their normal puppy raising, walks and socialisation. There's some variability. The error bars that are above the main bars there show the variability, but generally it's fairly constant across the 3 times. When we look at the neutrophil lymphocyte ratios, and this is a group of 10 dogs that we're looking at as our control group, it's a similar story, that there's no significant difference across the different times. So from this we can summarise that, as I've said, there's fairly stable levels of salivary cortisol and neutrophil lymphocyte ratios over time in the home environment, and although there's some variation, it suggests no significant effective time on these measures. That's important because when we compare it with the dogs that have entered kennels, represented in red, you can see there's quite a strong effect at time 2. And that's, as you remember, within 24 hours of entering the kennel facility. So what we can suggest here is at time 2 and time 3, which as you remember is a fortnight after time 2, something's going on with the dogs, and we can attribute that to their change in environment, which is entering the kennel facility. When we look at the neutrophil lymphocyte ratios, it's a similar response. Really nice concordance at time 1, and again quite a bit of difference at time 2 and 3. Now the group that entered kennels, there's 20 dogs in that group, and what we're representing here is the mean or averages of each of those groups. So when we looked at the results clinically, so not talking about necessarily statistically now, it was quite apparent there were 2 major trends between the dogs that came into kennels, and by applying a fairly simple rule, which was when they had their maximum reading within these 2 measures, we broke down that red group into 2 subgroups. Within the cortisol, they broke down fairly evenly. So 9 dogs demonstrated this peak recover trend, where there's quite a marked difference at time 2, and then they recover quite strongly at time 3. And the green group is what I've just termed the rising trend, and that comprised of 10 dogs. And what you see there is a steady increase over the 30-day period. Now what this demonstrates, actually we'll look at the neutrophil lymphocyte as well before we talk about what it demonstrates. So again, we've broken it down into the 2 trends. We've got 12 dogs and 5 dogs in the orange and green groups respectively. And again, you see a peak and recover trend or a rising trend. And what this suggests is that we're possibly looking at the difference between an acute response or a shorter term response and a chronic response, where the dogs are potentially getting more stressed. Now we don't know a fortnight down the track whether that green group would have recovered back to the time 1 levels or whether it would have continued to increase, because the study was limited to a 30-day period. Something to be looked at in the future. So the preliminary results summary can be described as suggesting that entering a kennel facility is a stressful event, even for very well socialised and adapted dogs. All of the dogs in this study had had between 4 and 5 visits to the kennel facility with prior experience, so they weren't naive to kennels. It wasn't like a shelter dog that may be entering a kennel facility for the first time. It demonstrates the variability amongst individual dogs' responses, even when genetics and upbringing are relatively constant. Because we found that there's quite high variability amongst the dogs, I guess some dogs recover faster and others get more stress than others. That's really relevant for us to know when we're managing a whole population of dogs. It's relevant to all dog populations, and particularly in terms of building better dogs, which is what we're here to talk about today. If we can identify those individuals that cope better in kennel facilities and still succeed as working dogs, we have the potential possibly to select for that within our breeding program. In the shorter term, because we now know about this stress response, we can evaluate methods that attempt to reduce the stress response, such as the use of enrichment programs. So the rest of my research project, or my PhD, is looking at the effects of a structured enrichment program on the behaviour, the physiology and the training success of our dogs at Guide Dogs Victoria. We're also looking at how dogs utilise enrichment opportunities. There's not much point providing raised beds for dogs in their kennels and giving them lots of toys if they're not actually going to utilise them. That's just a waste of resources and time. The information gained from the full extent of the research will further the scientific investigation into the effects of enrichment for dogs housed in kennel environments, in a manner that will prove relevant to industry and also a useful contribution towards the understanding of how enrichment programs affect the wellbeing of dogs that are housed in kennel facilities. These results can then be compared with temperamental assessment outcomes to see if provision of enrichment does significantly affect stress levels and whether any such effect through the assessment period influences their assessment scores and ultimate working success. I would like to thank a few people who've been quite supportive of this project. Obviously Guide Dogs Victoria, the State Government Bureau of Animal Welfare, IDEX Laboratory, who have provided in-kind support with the lab work, Monash University, Canon, who provided digital cameras for us to be able to view what the dogs are up to overnight and during the day, Aussie Dog Products, who've thrown in some toys, and a massive thank you to the RSPCA Australia for awarding me the Alan White Scholarship for Animal Welfare Research last year, because their support has paid for the bulk of the work I've spoken about today. Thanks.
Well done. Thank you, Mayor. We've got time for a very brief question, if there is one. I think there's one just there, the lady in the pink, just over there, far row, far aisle. A bit like
thank you, Mayor. I guess I want to ask a question to make a point, and it will be short. The first one, I think, is to be very clear that physiological measures of stress, such as cortisol and measures of immune function that you spoke about, don't necessarily equate to how the dogs feel about a situation that they've been put into. So I think we've got to be careful about the way that we use language. As a scientist, I think we use stress very freely at times, and it can actually be different to people who aren't that familiar with the scientific language around welfare science. So I think, obviously you showed that there's been an effect of kenneling. It may well have been that there's been more exposure to disease, for example, and that might well have had a knock-on effect on cortisol. So if the picture isn't clear until you start really adding the behavioural stuff in.
Yep.
And I don't even know that, I'm just making a general point. I think the other thing is to suggest that you might want to start looking at much more positive measures of emotion instead of always going for the negative. Stress is quite a negative thing, whereas I think if you look at measures of positive feeling, such as happiness and so on, as part of the study, that would be really good, because those are very recognisable signals from energy core, and it would be very nice to be able to see those being properly evaluated as scientific measures.
Thanks a lot for those comments, that's great. And certainly I've also looked at the behaviour, which is where the video footage comes in, and also that other measure of the IGA results. So I didn't have enough time today to talk about everything, but certainly we're looking at a nice round and robust study in terms of what we're looking at and how we're interpreting it. You're right in that some of the physiological measures can be the same for excitement as our general understanding of stress as a negative thing. But I guess, again, through having multiple measures, you can narrow down how you're interpreting that data. And when you're looking at both, I guess, immune function and, the behaviour, and if you're getting a correlation of behaviours that have been shown in previous research to be correlated with reduced welfare, and you're keeping a record of whether disease is occurring and being treated, that helps to narrow the interpretation towards a more correct interpretation, I guess. And I'd love to measure happiness, but I think that might be another whole PhD on its own. So I might leave that one for someone else. And certainly the physiology gives us a nice, measurable, numeric thing to work from, and it is the first step to being able to see a reduction in those negative things, because the next step is looking at how enrichment affects those. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Cheers. Thanks very much, Mary.